As the third part of the End of the Cold War series, it's time to look at the events that led to the fall of communism in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. It could be said that one of the most important signs of the weakening of the Soviet Union was shown in the Soviet-Afghan War between 1979 and 1989. In the war, several insurgent groups, known as the Mujahideen or jihadists, rose up against the socialist Soviet-supported government of Afghanistan, which prompted the USSR to help the Afghan government. A fierce guerrilla war ensued between the Mujahideen and the Soviet army and the Afghan army, into which other countries like the US and the UK got involved as well. The war altogether ended with a disgraceful Soviet defeat and withdrawal in 1989. The international community imposed numerous sanctions and embargoes against the Soviet Union, and the US led a boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics held in Moscow. The Soviets' failure in the war is thought to be a contributing factor to the fall of the Soviet Union. Another important event in the 1980s and another nail in the Soviet Union's coffin was the election of Republican US President Ronald Reagan, whose bullish and more hardline foreign policy meant more problems for Moscow. In a famous speech in 1983, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, asserting that the Cold War was a conflict between good and evil. Reagan was a staunch critic of the idea of mutual assured destruction, which of course meant that in case of a nuclear war, both countries would be destroyed. Reagan believed that there was a need to get an advantage over the USSR in terms of military technology, and he started the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which others later called the Star Wars program, to develop a space-based defense program against Soviet nuclear missiles. It was clear to the US that such technology was not available at the time, but it challenged the Soviet Union and prompted them to start to spend loads of money on military development. Famously, in 1987, in a speech given in Berlin, Reagan challenged Russian leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. He said, "If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." In 1986, a famous event shook the Eastern Bloc: the nuclear accident in Chernobyl, Ukraine, on the 26th of April 1986. The Chernobyl disaster is considered the worst nuclear power plant accident in history. The initial emergency response, together with later decontamination of the environment, ultimately involved more than 500,000 personnel and cost an estimated 18 billion Soviet rubles, that is, if adjusted for inflation, roughly 68 billion US dollars today. The cost of the cleanup therefore overburdened the fragile Soviet economy. Also, as famously dramatized in the 2019 HBO series Chernobyl, the accident made it clear that most of the lower-level Soviet leadership was incompetent, and that the highly centralized administrative system of the Soviet Union made the response incredibly slow. The Soviet premier that is known as the one to end the Cold War was Mikhail Gorbachev. However, in the dying years of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev tried to make reforms in the country. Although committed to preserving the Soviet state and its socialist ideals, Gorbachev believed significant reform was necessary to get out of the political and economic crisis. In terms of foreign policy, he withdrew from the Soviet-Afghan War and started summits with US President Ronald Reagan to limit nuclear weapons and to end the Cold War. Domestically, his policy of glasnost, or openness, allowed for enhanced freedom of speech and press, and also included a crackdown on political corruption and started a more transparent and streamlined system of administration in the USSR. His second reform idea, under the slogan Perestroika, or restructuring, sought to decentralize economic decision-making to improve its efficiency, and also adopted elements of liberal free market-based economy. However, it was clear by the late 1980s that Gorbachev's reforms could not save the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc, let alone bring it back to prominence. Due to the increased free speech and free media, the skeletons of socialism started to fall out of the cupboard. His attempts at democratization, or demokratizacja, for example, the creation of a new and more free parliament in Russia, had unforeseen consequences, as anti-socialist politicians like Boris Yeltsin, later president, also got a seat in the parliament. As prominent Russian opposition member and activist Yuri Orlov said, Gorbachev understood nothing when he began. All he knew was that socialism had to be improved. His idea was simple and close to Western thinking. If you take socialism and add democracy and free speech, all will be well. But what he discovered was that the system designed by Lenin was such that once you pulled out one brick, the whole thing fell apart. Mikhail Gorbachev also played an important part in the fall of communism by not playing any part in it. He chose not to intervene with the Soviet army when people in socialist countries broke down the socialist systems and announced independence. An important brick in the wall was pulled out in August 1989 when the first semi-free or free-ish elections were held in Poland. In the Sejm, the Polish parliament, around half of the seats were freely contested, and the new upper house, the Senate, could be filled with 100 new senators. Candidates of the Solidarity Trade Union of Lech Wałęsa, which formed a party for 1989, won most of the available seats. Hungary also played an important part in the breakdown of communism and the Iron Curtain in 1989. In early 1989, the Hungarian leadership began to disassemble the hard border system with Austria. In August, a peace demonstration was organized by Hungarian opposition movements, which went down under the sponsorship of Otto von Habsburg and prominent Hungarian socialist leader Imre Posgai. This was the so-called pan-European picnic on the Austrian-Hungarian border, which also saw the border being broken through by East German economic/political refugees living in Hungary, who could later travel to free countries like West Germany. The Hungarian leadership gave explicit orders to the border patrol not to attack the East Germans. Not only was the border between Austria opened, with this move Hungary basically stated that out of West Germany and East Germany, they prefer the West. A month later, Hungary would allow about 30,000 East Germans to cross the border and flee to the West. The mass emigration of East Germans via Hungary inspired new hopes in East Germany, and several opposition groups were formed in autumn 1989 with the aim of forging opposition movements and achieving reforms similar to several mass demonstrations in East Germany, with about 500,000 people gathering in the Alexanderplatz of East Berlin to protest the government. More and more East Germans wanted to escape the country, and the border control could just not keep up with it any longer. On the 9th of November, it was announced that the crossing points between West and East Germany, and also West and East Berlin, would be reopened for travel from the next day. However, the people of East Berlin could not wait until the next day when they heard the news, and they demanded that border guards immediately open the gates in the Berlin Wall. Finally, at 10:45 p.m. on the 9th of November, Harald Jäger, the commander of the Bornholmerstrasse border crossing, yielded and opened the wall between East and West Berlin, leading to the reunification of Berlin. Later, the whole west-east border was opened, which basically led to the end of the Iron Curtain between the East and the West worlds. Although the Eastern Socialist leader Erich Honecker had predicted in January of 1989 that the wall would stand for 50 or even 100 more years, his predictions were fortunately proven wrong, and the Berlin Wall, one of the symbols of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, fell in November 1989. The demolition of the wall officially began in the summer of 1990 and paved the way for German reunification. It was also during the summer that it was decided that Germany should be reunited, and the reunification process was complete on the 3rd of October 1990. It is important to emphasize that this quote-unquote new united Germany is not really a new state, but an enlarged continuation of the former West Germany, which is also suggested in the name of Germany today, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, or Federal Republic of Germany, which was also the official name of West Germany. The Chancellor of the reunited Germany became Helmut Kohl, who had been West German Chancellor since 1982. Social and economic problems had been present in socialist Romania for quite some time, especially during the years of austerity in the 1980s. On the 16th of December, there was a massive protest in Temeswar, or Timișoara, against the removal and eviction of Hungarian Reformed pastor Laszlo Tőkés. The protest was crushed by the Romanian Socialist secret police, the Securitate, leaving hundreds dead. On the morning of the 21st of December, Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu gave a televised speech in front of approximately 100,000 people to condemn the uprising in Temeswar. Thousands of workers were brought to Bucharest by the Socialist Party to listen to the speech and to show the popularity of Ceausescu. However, during the speech, the crowd began to boo and to chant the word Timișoara, Timișoara. In response, Ceausescu raised his right hand in hopes of silencing the crowd. His stunned expression remains one of the defining moments of the end of communism in Eastern Europe. After the speech, riots began to break out in Bucharest and other towns like Arad or Brașov, and the Romanian military sided with the protesters. The next day, Ceausescu tried to flee the capital with his wife Elena. However, they were captured by the military. A military tribunal was set up to charge the couple with genocide, damage to the national economy, and the general abuse of power, and they were found guilty. So, On Christmas Day 1989, the Ceausescus were convicted on all charges, sentenced to death, and immediately executed by a firing squad. This event ended socialism in Romania too. By 1991, growing nationalist sentiment, for example in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or Ukraine, threatened to break the Soviet Union into pieces. Although the hardline members of the Soviet Union and its Socialist Party attempted a coup to take control of the country from Soviet President and General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, the coup collapsed due to the opposition of Gorbachev and of Russian anti-socialist leader Boris Yeltsin. The growing nationalist demonstrations and the weakening support for socialism in Russia led Gorbachev and the Supreme Soviet, or the Supreme Council of the Soviet Union, to decide to dissolve the Soviet Union on the 25th of December 1991. The USSR therefore broke apart into many national republics, the biggest being Russia, or the Russian Federation, whose first elected leader was former opposition leader Boris Yeltsin. By 1991, the last remnant of the Cold War was thus over. Or was it?